Okay, uh, so today let's see. First, open the lectures, the notes from last time from Monday. So, by the way, I tried to put here the quiz that you had that we had last time is not very not that hard, but at least you have there what those of you who didn't have the chance to come last class, that you kind of know what we were doing. Yeah. Then we started to talk about I think we had the quiz. We had some discussion on the reference material that I hope all of you have read on onshore, offshore oil and gas. And then we had an exercise you were working with the simulator. And actually some of the equations that hopefully we will use today for our first exercise are kind of, this simulator is based on those equations. Okay, so it's not that, it's not a toy, but it's also based on some physics. Yeah. And then we started to see, and that's actually what I want to focus today. It's to try to think of the field as a mechanical analog, that you have two places where you have fixed pressures, more or less. Okay, at a given time, the reservoir pressure is fixed, separator pressure is fixed, and then you have some resistance to go from the formation that you have from the subsurface all the way to the top side. Okay, and we try to say a few important points along the way. So I say you have flow in porous media, and that will be that restriction here. And then you reach, it's important for you to remember the nomenclature. So you have flowing bottom hole pressure, also called BHP. Then you go flow in the tubing, basically flow in a pipe which is deviated, inclined, or might be vertical. And you reach to wellhead pressure. And usually you have this control element, which is what allows you to keep, for example, plateau rate constant, or the rate constant. And that's the choke, and in that case we have to make a distinction. We call this usually P downstream the choke. And then we can have, depending on our system, might be a subsea well, or might be, for example, a platform well. We might have a pipe that takes to the separator. Okay? And essentially what I'm producing, I'm emptying that tank. So the PR is going to go down with time. This pressure, we had some discussion, we don't change it that much in the life of the field, because we know it causes a lot of issues in the plant. So basically how much I can produce is driven by that difference in pressure. Okay? And of course the losses that you have in between, which are kind of fixed. Okay, this flow in the formation will be like that for the life of the field, unless something happens to damage, to make it more difficult for the fluid to reach the bottom hole of the well. Okay, we discussed some things like gas coning, water coning. You can have formation collapse. You can have sand production. You can have also, sometimes has been reported to have scaling. Okay, some blockage, some scale that builds up in the pores, and they start to make the permeability lower. Okay, and you have also wax. Okay, might have wax, which is not that common, but you might have wax forming in the formation if it's very cold. But essentially what I'm saying is that these usually they remain, don't change during the life of the field. Okay, the only thing that will change is the things that I can modify, that I can vary, and that will be typically a choke, or if I have any booster, or if I have a compressor, if I have a pump, that's something that I will change. Okay, so if you see there, you have some loss of energy from that formation. Some of them will be unchanged, but some of them I can change, modify, either to give me more rate, which is usually the case, or to keep production, on a certain level, which might be desirable by, for some reason. Okay. So hopefully today we are going to have an exercise. I will try to do it with you, but I hope that most of you try to tag along with me. Okay, and for that we have to talk a bit about first the equations that we're going to use. Okay, so that will be for dry gas. I'm going to make some comments why dry gas equations. Then we have to know a bit about, you're not going to do everything from scratch in Excel, but we have already a series of functions, okay, that you're going to use, so we are going to use. So we have to give a short introduction to VBA, and then we do the exercise, hopefully by the end of the lecture. Okay, let's hope that we manage. Okay, so production scheduling, if you remember, was to plan and predict the production rates with time, okay, of the field. And we say will be of the three main phases, right? Will be oil, gas, and water. But essentially there is one which is the field is either an oil field or a gas field, and that will be the one that I will be controlling and looking most closely. But also due to bottlenecking, all kind of other things, design of the facilities, I want to compute the other two. Okay, if it's gas, oil, and water, oil condensate because it gives me this extra revenue that can change the economy of the field, and water because simply it causes a lot of issues in the plant. Okay, and also oil, the same thing. Oil, I want to calculate gas. Maybe gas simply re-inject, don't get any revenue out of it, but it will cause some changes in the design of my separator, my compressor station, okay, and water, the same thing. Okay, so I'll say production profiles, which are or maybe we can say, in a broader sense, we can say field performance. Okay. We want to see how the field, because the idea, remember, in the design phase is we have tried to create a synthetic field. Okay, we have a real field there. We are not sure about all the details of this reservoir that we made, but we want to make like a surrogate. We want to make an image. Okay, which now you will call a digital twin, okay, in this era. But you try to create a digital twin and you try to produce it in many different ways and try to see which one is the best. And finally, when you do that exercise, you see which one is the best. That's the strategy that you apply in your real field. Okay, in the real field you have one shot, no more than that. Okay, but in the digital twin, in this model that we have, we can do it many times and see which one is best. Okay. So production profiles can be estimated, or are typically estimated, and there are a few methods that some of you, or I guess most of you, will be familiar with. And one of the preferred methods is with reservoir simulator. Okay, you try to represent which reservoir simulator. Essentially, I'm trying to solve. It's a model that tries to make first a 3D representation of my volume that I have, of my all the properties, all the parameters. Okay, try to make a 3D representation of my volumes. Okay, then I start to subdivide those volumes. Okay, and then I apply conservation equation, some sort of mass conservation equation between each block. Okay, each block has a certain amount of fluid, certain amount of pressure, and then to compute the flow, what is transferred between one block and the other, you use some sort of Darcy law, okay, with permeability. The main thing with reservoir simulation is that you need some, so typically you have some boundary conditions which are, you try to represent the aquifer, right? So you include the aquifer sometimes in that simulation. But essentially, all the other external boundary conditions are usually no flow. Okay, you apply simply nothing is flowing in and out. Okay, I try to represent the whole volume. Unless there is a fault, communication with the neighboring reservoir, but usually you try simply to say the block, and I have no flow coming in and out through the external bounds. Okay, but you have some boundary conditions in some cells which are the wells. Okay, that's where you're saying that's where I'm going to produce. I make a hole and I make a condition on that particular cell, that's where I'm going to be draining fluid. Okay? So for those of you who are versed in reservoir simulation, okay? So what kind of conditions you specify in these wells that I have here? If you remember from anyone had a course on reservoir simulation? Yeah. So what kind of condition do you specify on the well?
Valve pressure, bottom hole valve pressure,
Mm-hmm.
and also flow rate.
Okay. You specify basically two things. Okay. You specify something that is called a target rate. Okay. Either of oil or gas. Okay. But QT. And that's how much I want to produce. If I will be at plateau rate, simply that will be the rate that I want, the fixed rate that I want to produce with time. And the second is you specify a minimum bottom hole pressure. So the simulator first will try to say, I try to produce that rate, okay? And actually, we will see it operates slightly different, but I say if I cannot produce that rate, simply I switch to this minimum bottom hole pressure. Okay, I operate at a constant bottom hole pressure. Okay, but I try first, the simulator will try to produce this target rate, okay? And then it's fine. If I can produce it, will be fine. But if not, then change to minimum pressure. And it's typically bottom hole pressure. Okay? And this minimum bottom hole pressure is supposed to represent the things that we were discussing last lecture. Okay, it's supposed in the reservoir simulation we are just basically simulating up to that point. Okay, the formation, the kind of the storage effect, and we are simulating also this kind of flow from here all the way to here. Okay, that's essentially what we are trying to capture. Okay, so I have to represent all of that system in the reservoir simulator. I have to put a pressure that I think has to be enough to go from this point all the way to the facilities. Okay. Okay. But of course, that pressure we will see now is actually changing with time. That pressure that I need is actually not a unique number, but it's something that will depend on rate. Okay, how much rate, how much water do I have, how much. So that's like a simplistic approximation. This approach here, it will depend on how big the rates are, how much gas, how much water do I have, how much oil do I have. Okay? It will depend on these things. So a workflow that we use in typically or in field development to compute, and here the main thing is realistic production profiles. Okay, so we have typically the guys which are the reservoir engineering. Okay, where you have usually a 3D reservoir model, and in that model I compute is based on Q target rates and PWF mean, okay, that they assume, and sometimes that can be also changing with time. Okay, and also the Q rates then can be changing with time. But they make their analysis. They start to, for example, so I have some plateau rate, I fix some rates, and I use some minimum pressure, okay, that I have used maybe before in other projects, depending on the water depth. They have some rule of thumb, and they basically say, well, I run, and from here I obtain my Q, okay, my production profile. Okay. Then you have another department, which is the department usually is production engineering and facilities production. That these guys have is a production simulator. Okay, production simulator basically is a steady state, okay, simulator. The reservoir is by nature is transient, okay, so that simulator has to take care of what happens in time, while this one can simply be a steady state. And then they check at each point in time is this QT feasible. Okay, that means if I will be able with that Q and PWF that I record, okay, with time, is that going to be enough to reach, okay, here we have, will that feasible, and feasible here means the separator. Okay, so they go and check with this value and the PWF with time that they have sent. They go to their model steady state, and each point in time they go and check, is it enough to reach the separator? Okay, and they sometimes it might take measures to try, so they try to make it feasible. Okay, either by changing tubing size, either by including artificial lift, either by maybe changing, doing some, for example, gas lift. They try to make that rate, they might to be, they try to make that rate simply that it can work, okay? Because supposedly reservoir engineer, they are applying those rates because they lead to higher recovery factors. They have some objective why they are using those rates. Okay, so they lead to high recovery factor. They lead to high revenue. They think that these are the best rates. Okay. Okay, and then you have a feedback loop where you flag some years where it's not possible. Okay. Okay, simply you say, according to production engineer, they say, well, in years, I don't know, from 10 to 15, you won't be able to produce that ring. Simply, it's not enough to reach the separator. Okay, so they give back that feedback to the reservoir engineering department, and the cycle starts again. Okay, and there is usually a fight between them because the reservoir engineers say, let production take care of that, they will find a way to produce it, and production say, no way, I cannot produce that, and there is some iteration. Okay. Okay, but take in mind, the guys in the left, they are the custodians, and they are the managers, and they are like the owners of the reservoir model. Okay, and the guys on the right, they are the owners of the production model. Okay, they know all the details about the facilities, the sizing, the wells, everything, and they have to simply communicate. Okay, because the production profile is actually a result of both. Okay, if we look again at our analog, is the result of this part, which is very important. Okay, it has a significant effect to model that part and to understand this part on my production profile, but also this part. Okay, we should never neglect the importance of this part. Okay, and of course, if you are at a very early phase of field development, probably this part is the reservoir model. I have a very crude and very primitive model, but I have something, right? Based on seismic, based on geology, based on petrophysics, based on something. But these guys usually, if you're at the very early phase, you have no idea how the well will look like, what kind of diameter I'm going to need, the trajectory of the pipe, for example, at the bottom of at the sea bottom. So one assumption that is typically made, simply I compute production profile simply using the reservoir model. Okay, without taking into account the facilities. So let's put that comment here. Okay. And as they are neglected, you see that has an impact. This process is actually very important to see that those rates are going to be feasible. Okay, so it is not done because it doesn't exist, this model, or I don't have any idea how I'm going to produce it. It actually causes some inaccuracy in these profiles that I calculate. Okay, if my reservoir engineers made a good job at predicting this minimum bottom hole pressure, it might be over predictive, under predicted, or it might be spot on. Okay. Yeah. So you use reservoir simulator. Some improvement that has been made now in these late years is that people use reservoir simulator coupled with a well gathering network simulator. Okay, and we're going to see now a bit, maybe what the word coupled means. But basically, I try to join these two models such that all predictions that I calculate already take that into account. Okay, I try to take out the middleman. Okay, this might be a manual process. It happens through emails, through meetings, sending information manually, and it can be very time consuming. That department takes a few weeks to generate these profiles. Then that department takes also some weeks to verify those rates, and then they have to send back their comments. Okay, so to avoid that time delay process, simply they try to couple these models in. This is typically called in a IAM software. Okay, IAM stands for Integrated Asset Management. Okay, so let me just write here some examples of okay, reservoir simulator. We have one of the most famous is Eclipse. You have CMG. You have the new version of Eclipse, which is Intersect. Okay, what else do we have? Nexus. What else? Petrel, but that's not really reservoir. Okay, that Petrel is for the geo modeling. You have also kind of MATLAB, MRST. You have now this OPM, Open Porous Media. You have a sensor. Okay, some companies, they have their own simulator. Aramco has Powers and Gigapowers. I think Chevron, they have their own simulator. Okay, and these guys, the production guys, what do they use? Okay, we have PipeSim. We have Prosper and Gap. Some people use Olga, which is by Schlumberger also. I think there is a program called PipeSoft. There is one called from Weatherfork or Rio. Okay, but essentially there are two different programs maintained by two different departments, even by different company, and you want to put these two together. So here you have some platforms for integrated asset management. Resolve is one of them. You have Avoset. You also have one Pipeit from a company here in Trondheim, which is now Tieto. Okay. But as I told you, that might be challenging, especially in early field, because you need to have a model of this part which might not exist. Okay, there is a big uncertainty around it. What kind of well size, how spread are going to be the wells, what will be the topography of the seabed, what will be exactly the water depth, what is separator pressure, for example. Okay, the sizing of the lines. All of these, they require a lot of engineering work based on information that is not available at that point in time. Okay. Other options I can use to estimate production profiles.
Material balance.
Material balance. But usually material balance is not enough. I have to have what I call an IPR equation. Inflow performance relationship. Okay. So material balance, this guy tells me how pressure, how saturations, okay, of gas, oil, and water are going to change versus time. okay, or depending how much I'm draining for that volume. That's what material balance is. Instead of having all of these blocks that I make here to subdivide the volume, I simply make a big block, okay, and then I say all of that is going to change uniformly. When I take out some amount of oil, some amount of gas, that's how these variables are going to change. Okay. And then on top of that, I need some IPR relationship that tells me what is the relationship between rate as a function of reservoir pressure and bottom hole flowing pressure. Okay. So this guy comes from the material balance, but this guy here is actually an assumption. So then I have to make an assumption on PWF. Okay. So needs assumption on PWF minimum. Okay, so still I need this minimum. Okay, another approach which is a bit more advanced than this one is material balance. Okay, material balance, remember, is a tank, single tank, a reservoir simulator, and then you have material balance plus a well and network model, in which I couple these and I do my calculations exactly the same way, but here I have Q has a function of PR and P separator. Okay. Okay, I include my model, doesn't include only up to the bottom hole, but also includes all the way to the separator. What other things do we use to calculate the rates?
Darcy.
Darcy, which is like IPR. Okay, I use some sort of. Okay, I use some. We will see now a bit about. For those of you who are not familiar, we will see kind of have a crash course introduction to IPR. Okay, but essentially it's a relationship that tells me if I apply this drawdown in the well, how much rate I'm going to get. Okay. Also, something that is very much used in the US is some sort of decline curves, okay? Decline or type curves. That I simply say I have some decline in time of wells, okay? Typical declines. It might decline like that, it might decline like that, it might decline like that, okay? And I say, based on experience, this particular reservoir is similar to another one we produced before, and it had this type curve decline. Okay? It's very simplistic. I try to group by categories, wells, and then I try to make a field based on some combination of these wells. Okay? Let's say I will have 30% will be good producers. They decline in this way. Then 30% will be bad producers, and the rest will be medium producers. Okay. And that's something I make either for example, in the onshore planning, but I typically use it in very early phase. Okay. At least in Norway. Okay. So the main, what we are going to use in our course is going to be this approach, okay? Because simply it's slightly easier to make exercise based on this approach, and also you are including both important parts to calculate production profile. Okay, so we are going to be focusing on this particular case. No, sorry, in this case, material balance and well and network model. Okay, but we are going to make. I'm going to give some comments on decline or type curves. How are they related somehow with the other approaches, and what is people try to do with this decline. And we are going to give some comments about the coupling. Okay, how, if you use that approach, what kind of coupling, what is happening in every time step. Okay, which is a bit similar of the way we do it here, that coupling, but you get slightly different information from the reservoir simulator. Okay, that clear, more or less? Okay. Okay, so let's okay, so we are going to have an exercise which is a production scheduling of the Snohvit field. Okay, Snohvit. See if we have some nice. That's white, but that's not the field we're looking for. Okay, it's a field located quite up north, and it's let me just search for Snohvit. Thought we had some nice. Okay, it's a subsea field. You have some well clusters that are producing from, I think there are 2 reservoir units, and then you have a big transportation pipe all the way to shore, and in shore you have this LNG plant which converts, because you have no, at that point in Norway, at that location, which was far up north, you don't have any pipeline to take that gas anyplace. Okay, so the way they send it to the market, they have an LNG plant, they have an LNG tanker, and that is sent to markets. I think they have agreements with Spain, okay, to sell this gas. Okay, so let's take steal this photo from. Okay, so one of the things we can say, it's a relatively dry gas field. Okay, and if we are going to make its structure, it will be, I think the way it was originally was 3 wells producing to a common point. These wells are in what we call a template. They are in a structure. We're going to talk a bit about that later, but basically they are on a template, subsea template, from where I drill all of them from more or less the same point, and then they are deviated going into the formation. Then I have the same thing. I have 3 templates, I think, and they join in a common point at this point, which is the PLEM, so it's pipeline entry module, and then we have a long transportation pipe that goes to shore, okay, and goes to this separator and to this LNG plant. Okay. And all of these are in templates. Okay, I have 3 templates, and each template has 3 wheels. So I have, in total, I have 9 wheels. And our interest in this field, and all of them are producing, of course, from the same, how do we put the reservoir? Let's say the reservoir is here. Okay. And all of these wells are producing from the same reservoir. Okay. So our interest here, our main task is to compute Q gas versus time. And the field is has a contract for to deliver to customers, contract to deliver 20 million standard cubic meter per day. They convert that amount to LNG, and then they ship it to customers in, I think they have in US and Spain. Okay, so you want to find out QG and essentially plateau duration and post plateau production. Okay, essentially that's what we need. Okay, so to do that we need a few ingredients. We need and we need to make also some assumptions. So let's take a break now, 15 minutes, and we come back and we start to look into what kind of assumptions do we have to make, what kind of equations do we need, and how are we going to do that in Excel, okay, in the Excel sheet. Okay, but let's take first a 15 minutes break.